Hello and welcome back to the Go-Karts and Good Times YouTube channel. If you're new to the channel, this is my 1990 Miata, which is now in the process of becoming a Deathkart. I kept it a secret on the channel for a while, or at least didn't reveal my plans exactly, but I do want to get the ball rolling on this thing, and the first step to that is actually putting on some wheels and tires that are usable, getting these ones cleaned up to sell, and starting to get this thing cleaned up before I start to chop it. While it does start up and the engine seems to be pretty reliable, it's still missing a radiator, so I try not to run it for more than a couple minutes at a time. And there is a brake line that is probably rotted through somewhere because the pedal goes straight to the floor and I have to use the e-brake to stop it. Also, it is an auto and has a lot of rust, but that doesn't matter because most of this metal is getting chopped out anyway, and it's nothing that a little bit of cutting and welding can't fix. The manual swap is a bigger issue, but it shouldn't be too expensive if I keep my eye out for parts locally, which I have been, and collecting them. To keep this project manageable, I do want to work on one thing at a time, and the first step is getting it cleaned up and then starting to work on the actual metal that's here. I do have a decent amount of stock to get some of the worst rust areas fixed up, and I do already have welding gas and wire, so getting these things resolved will be at a very low cost to me and will keep this a very much budget build. Last week I picked up this set of NB Miata rims, which do have some pretty dusted center caps, but for $125 I cannot complain at all. They look better than the NA rims on now that have pretty bad paint and have terrible 20-year-old tires that have no tread left. If you look at these, they actually have a decent amount of use left in them, and while they are a cheap tire, looking up reviews online, they suck in the winter, but they're actually decent summer tires, so they should suit my needs very well. So the first step for today is getting these old, nasty wheels and tires swapped out for the new ones, which I will spare you the boring details of. Well, I've got the wheels off. I thought I'd show you what exactly I'm working with in here. The first thing you'll notice is that it's very rusty, and that's the reason that I'm cutting up this car and turning it into what it's going to be. I didn't want to take a good Miata and do something like this, nor could I actually afford a good Miata, so this is what we've got. Obviously, I'll be replacing the suspension with blown struts and snap springs, and the brakes need some help with that busted line like I said, and these ones are a little bit stuck, but if we bring it to the rear here, someone actually did do some brake work on this car at some point more recently than I had suspected, so that is a good thing to see. Taking a look at, say, the subframe, people who are not from the Northeast will see this and say it's unsafe, it's extremely rusty, but as you can see, it's still totally solid, and I'll have to go around and check every structural component of the car and make sure that there are no actual holes and that they're going to be safe to use. I'm not concerned about the rust, and parts like this will hopefully be swapped out for nicer ones as part outs pop up. All that being said, I don't have the time or the parts to actually work on the brakes today or assess that brake line, but I'm going to quickly get these wheels swapped out so that I can at least work on getting these ones cleaned up and sold to get some money in my pocket to go forward with buying more things for the car. With just one side done and imagining the car a little bit cleaned up, these wheels and actual usable tires make it look a lot better. And obviously it still is a stripped out carcass, but it looks just a little bit less dumpy without those poorly painted and spent old wheels on it. It started to rain, but I got the car inside just in time. And it's not great to see how the new wheels look with it jammed into the garage, but like I said before, it's a night and day difference because the thing looks like less of a piece of junk. I've got some supplies now, but I've got to take off and I'll be revisiting the Miata. It's the next day and I'm back, and the first thing I want to do is get a coat of paint on these center caps to see if it's even close at all to the color. With the test pass on a flat surface, it is a little bit more chromy than I think the wheel color actually is, but maybe you can't tell on camera, but these are textured, they're not perfectly smooth, and so are the center caps, which with a light coat actually do look pretty decent. Of course, I'll actually have to pop one in to see how far off it is, but I don't think it'll be super bad looking, especially considering that before it was just beat up plastic, and from a distance they'll blend in well enough. Now while I wait for that paint to dry, I'm going to start pulling back the wiring up front and in the rear in areas of the car that are going to be cut. And the rear is a little bit more involved because a lot more is going to be chopped off, and I have things like battery cables and other fuel components back here that have to be really pushed out of the way and made sure that they're not cut. In either case, I'm going to start getting this stuff tidied up and marking where I'm going to be making my initial cuts. A short time later, and all of the wiring in the front end that I'll be chopping off is removed. One priority of mine that I wanted to make the build stand out that not many other people do is keeping the flip-up headlights, which is why I'll be cutting off the front end, starting here instead of farther back towards the strut tower. I'm going to go all the way down with a line across, and one other thing that I was thinking about doing but I'm not sure yet is cutting it right here so that I still have the stock radiator mount and it's still cut back enough so that I have plenty of room to put a tube front end on. I do want part of the tube front end to wrap under the headlights and around where this stock upper support is anyway, and then have that triangular style that wraps around with a jack point on the front. Obviously this is pretty far out in the future and I'm just voicing what I'm thinking right now. I don't actually have metal in front of me, but that's kind of the general idea. This means that I'll be breaking the camera back out when I start making cuts. Before I get to that, however, it's now the moment of truth. The center caps are dried and I popped all 4 of them in. Obviously they're not an exact match, but compared to the faded plastic that was on there before, they actually look pretty good. From a few feet of distance, you can barely tell, and they make the car again look a little bit more finished. Especially when I start getting the bent rusty metal cut off, it should start to look a lot better, even though there will be less and less of the car. I'm at the point where I can start making some cuts now, so I'm going to set up the tripod and get to work. And for now, I'm probably going to leave the frame rails fully intact before I figure out where exactly I want to cut them back. But again, like I said, I just want to get some of this loose, beat up and rusty metal off and out of the way to start cleaning up the front end and taking care of things one little thing at a time. Between maximum 20-minute video lengths, no time-lapse mode, and a dying battery, I do actually have the front end chopped up just about where I need it to be before I go back for a final sanding, grinding, or finishing touch and start actually building off of what's here. I'm no good at talking, but you get what I mean. I've got as much metal chopped off that I can for now on the front end, and eventually, probably another day, I'll have to turn the car around and get to the back. I'm back for another day of work, and while I am thankful for the nicest day in a while, it is extremely hot out, and a hot day is not the day I want to be cooped up inside trying to work on the brake lines of the Miata. So instead, I think I'm going to pull the car out into the lawn and start chopping up the rear end, which is a little bit more scary because there's a lot more metal back here, and a lot more metal I actually want to save, but I'll just start slowly and piece by piece start removing things, maybe even look up what others have done online so I don't accidentally cut too much. Despite all the rust, despite being an automatic, and despite the other problems this car has, the one reason I got it is because it starts every single time. And now it's time, like before, to get an extension cord run out here and start making little cuts to get this rear end disassembled. Unfortunately, now I have to take off for work, but I got a decent amount accomplished, and I got rid of most of the metal that I know for sure has to be gone off the back of this car. You can see here that it did have some kind of rear end collision, and this frame rail is pretty crunched, but I'm 99% sure that I'll be cutting it farther up, so that'll be fine in the long run. Up here it gets a bit more complicated where there's multiple layers of metal, and I do have to be careful of the tires and how much of the wheel well I do want to save. I don't think there'll be any metal above the wheels, but I have to be careful about some of the more structural metal down here that continues up through the car. For a couple of hours of work, I'm pretty pleased with the progress, and I'll have to come back another day and finish up getting the rear cut out before I move on to either the brakes or getting this rusty metal up where the hole is cleaned up so that I can start thinking about reconstructing a frame rail and getting a new floor pan welded in. I'm back for another day of working on the Miata after a long morning of walking around the car show, which will actually be in another video. We went to the Syracuse Nationals. It was a great time and a lot of good cars came out, especially after not having the event last year. As far as the Miata goes, I think I'm going to continue and move on to this fender the same as I did before, peeling the metal back so that I only remove the outer layer for now before I go in deeper. And I'm probably going to get the rear somewhat cut off. I know a lot of people recommend that you keep as much there as possible because you don't know how far back that last roll cage mount is going to be, whether it's here or whether it's here. But one thing I do know is that this frame rail is crunched, and I'm probably going to cut it off right at the first point where there's good metal, and this still leaves plenty of room for mounting that last roll cage point, because looking at pictures, most people have them cut off so that there's only a couple inches of the old spare wheel well here, or whatever this dip in the trunk pan is. So I'm leaving more than twice that by cutting it off where the good metal starts here, and I should be plenty safe when I do get the roll cage in the future. With the other side, I'm just going to start removing layers, something that you've already seen and is inconvenient to document with this camera because of no time lapse and 20-minute video caps, as well as the not amazing battery life because it is not a new camera by any means. So I'm probably just going to get to work on this other side and getting the tray cut off, and then update you when I get to a good stopping point. As you can see, I've got the other side trimmed down approximately to where the other was. Obviously, the rust was much worse down here on the other side, so it kind of fell apart. And again, I keep mentioning that I don't want to cut too much, but I did get a large section of the back chopped off. Of course, this is a rough cut. I didn't do any measuring really, so you can tell it's crooked, but it's probably going to be back another 6 inches that I'm going to lob off. In the case that I did actually cut it pretty close to where the roll cage is going to sit, that's fine. I know I didn't chop too much off. This frame rail is a bit more crunched than I thought, but as I trim it back further, I'll be able to get in there, straighten it out more, and if I was concerned about it being an issue structurally, I could always plate one side of it with an extra piece of metal to strengthen it up to alleviate any concerns of it being a problem in a crash situation. Next, I'm probably going to continue by cutting through these top layers here, which I don't need to save at all because it's basically just going to be trimmed down to this flat level of the deck in the rear of the Miata. So, like I said earlier, I'm going to get to more chopping and try and save the amount of video of that I'll actually have in the final cut of this video. I keep talking way too much and I want to keep this short, so I'm going to get to work and continue getting more lobbed off. It's a new day and I hadn't even bothered to turn on the camera until now because I just got to work again. Unfortunately, I'm out of cutting wheels, so I'll have to make a stop to Harbor Freight, but you can see I've gotten a lot done with most of the rear wheel wells removed and most of that unnecessary sheet metal off. Another exciting part that I was waiting to show off is this Kirky seat, which I found locally for a really good deal. And while I don't have seat brackets for it, and I don't know where exactly I'm going to mount it yet, I did pop it in for a quick ride around the yard, and it feels great and fits the car perfectly. It is yet another day of cutting up the Miata, but I have more supplies for marking up and getting sheet metal taken away from these problem areas before I can start moving on to cleaning up some of these cuts and trimming things back closer to the final point where they're supposed to be. I've got a bit more accomplished with both sides trimmed up a lot closer to where they're going to be in the final product. Obviously not that close, but closer. And I didn't have a lot of time to work with it, but I'm just trying to fit in a little bit of cutting and grinding each day so that eventually it will get done. Once again, I'll have to come back for another day to watch that pile grow even bigger. After another couple hours of grinding, the Miata is finally trimmed down to almost its final form factor. As you can see, the remains of the wheel wells are trimmed way down, and all that extra loose metal around this area of the car is removed. I do think I removed a little bit more than I needed to, but like I said, for just about every other part of the car, I can go back, add more reinforcement, and box this area in with sheet metal. I actually have both sides done, or at least done for now, with most of it smoothed out to where I'd be happy with in the future in a final painted product. But there's always a little bit more room to trim it back by leaving things long, and the rear end is basically done. Next, I want to focus my attention on the hole in the floor and start stripping away some of this rust to expose good metal and planning out the different sheets of metal I'm going to weld and wear to construct a complete and strong floor pan and rebuild the frame rail. While it is almost completely trimmed down, I still have to remove more of the rust, and as you can see, I pulled the car inside because this is where I have to do all the welding. I realized that before trying to weld through not the right gauge wire that runs out to that garage and welding through a bad extension cord in here, that I wasn't getting enough power and therefore my welds were bad. I'm not trying to use this as an excuse, I'm just saying that next time, especially for structural components of this car, I need to get the most amount of power that I can out of the wall socket I have over there. The more days and the more clips, the more spread out and chaotic this video is going to get, but as you can see, the car is up on jack stands and I have the front driver's side wheel off because there was actually some rust up here in the wheel well. As you can see, the structural metal underneath is actually in good shape, so I cut out this little patch of where there were some crusty bits and I'm going to weld in a little piece of metal to get that rot out of there. As you can see up here, I've also trimmed away a lot more metal, and while it isn't cleaned up that well, I do have to go through, do a final sanding, or at least use the wire wheel to clean it up a little bit more, brake clean, and then I think I'm going to get right in to cutting patch panels and starting to get this stitched back together. I almost forgot, I'm going to make heavy use of this weld through primer for pieces of metal I get on. As you can see here, it's kind of a mess, but there's enough good metal exposed so that I can weld in a little patch, and I'm going to start up here because it's a less important area of the car, and you'll see when I get started here. Just like that, the first patch is done, and you can kind of tell what I'm going for here. I just want to make it strong and remove any holes that are in the chassis. If you look a little bit closer, you can see my welds are, let's just say, not choice, and I don't want to make excuses, but this is Swiss cheese metal. And while I do have a new bottled welding gas, the little flow meter was bumped at some point in time and does not function correctly. So I kind of had to do a bit of guessing and checking as far as the amount of gas I was using combined with wire speed and heat. But no matter how much you want to say the welds look bad, the hammer bounces right off. There's no longer give from rotted metal, and it'll be plenty strong for a non-essential part of the chassis. Now I'm going to move up here and continue on making little cardboard cutouts and then cutting those pieces of cardboard in the correct shape out of metal. This is a great tip if you're ever trying to do weird shapes or patchwork with welding. Use cardboard to make templates, and then you'll know exactly what size, cut a little extra, and then have room to trim it back in the future. Don't mind my atrocious tack welds or the areas where I filled up little tiny pinholes in the metal, but the welds look pretty decent on that side, and this side it's a lot worse starting off, and I haven't finished it, but I'll have to hammer it in place and then go back and clean things up again so that I can get a good solid bead around every edge of this piece of metal. Again, I left it long and I'll have to trim it back, especially on the frame rail side, but it's just like this, a bunch of trial and error and making progress towards a finished product that is strong and looks good. With this patch, I'm back to crappy welds because I tried to save as much stock metal as possible, and that means that a decent amount of it was pretty holy and pretty rusty, especially on this inside edge here. But I sat in the car, I kicked it, it does not move, and it is very structurally sound. Coming up underneath, the same is true for the other patch pieces that I did. Some of them aren't very pretty, but at least each side has a full bead of weld, and other areas are just tacked in place. And I think this is a good spot so that I can build forward with the frame rail and the floor pan. I'll probably end up reinforcing this side before I think about putting a floor pan in. And like I said, look at that seat bracket. But I did run out of wire, so I have to swap out a new spool. It has been more days than I would have liked to have passed, but working to get the money to actually work on my projects and other things have kept me busy, but I'm here and back. As you can see, I have this weird angle iron, which is scrap metal like I mentioned before, and going forward you will see that it's going to look a little cobbled together, but that's because all this metal is stuff I had and I'm trying to keep the budget extremely low. After a bit of a struggle, I do have the first piece of angle iron in for the seat support. You can see that it's very, very bent out of 90 degrees, and that's because it was a bit smaller than the gap that I was actually bridging here. You'll also see that there are sections of okay weld here and there, but you can see this is rusty metal. Around the edges where I cut, the metal is significantly thinner than the good spots, and you'll see here and there that I'd be going okay and then start to burn through because just look at what I'm working with here. But that is strong, and the floor no longer has any flex on this side. So I'm going to work on making a piece to fit in here to get that end boxed off. Finish up with some more welds. Probably not worry about the low areas here unless I make little square pieces to fill them in. And then start looking at what I'm going to do for the front and for the top for keeping this rigid even though it is reinforced, especially this right here. Yet another quick update. This looks like a mess, but you can see I've got that thinner piece of metal welded on top. Like I said, these welds aren't amazing. And you can see here around where the seat brackets mount, I do actually have the welds grinded smooth, and that's because there will need to be brackets that go flush on the surface. And it's still a little bit hot because I just got done with it, but it is even stronger than before, and going forward with the angle iron on the front, this thing is probably going to be stronger than stock. Because I'm doing way too much talking in this video, a lot of it's going to get cut out, but as it sits now, I think I need more metal, or at least better metal suited for reconstructing the frame rail, which is what I want to base my framing for the floorboard on. So I'm going to see if I can get a hold of some metal for cheap or even free to start working on that moving forward. But for now, I think I have to take a break or focus my attention elsewhere. It's been a little while since I did an update, so I'm not sure where exactly I left off, but as you can see, there is a frame rail in the car, and the front of the floor pan is now finished, and I can begin reinforcing the seat brace and then actually putting that new floor pan in. I went about this by using 1.5 inch square stock and plating off the stock frame rail, sending it up inside of the old one sticking out of the bottom there, and then plating it all in where there was missing or weak metal, and then adding in pieces like this so that I have a nice line to work with going forward for putting in the new floor, and everything is all closed up and tied together. Before I was interrupted, as I was saying earlier, I'm working my way around, doing things piece by piece until I slowly get it done, which is where I am with the driver's side, almost ready to get the floor pan installed. But as it sits now, I have all the bracing, all the reinforcement, and all the structural metal that I needed to add in place so that I can actually get that floor bolted in right on top, and then start thinking about things like making seat brackets for the Kirky I have to put in the car, or moving on to the other side, which also needs some rust repair before I can actually call the floors done. Like I said many times before in this video, I'm going to get to work and update you when I get to a point that warrants me bringing out the camera. Because the floor is already reinforced, I don't really feel the need to weld in the floor pan to add rigidity to this side of the car. And for welding and time's sake, I think I'm just going to use self-tappers. I tested it out on the same piece here, and it goes in, threads itself kind of nicely, so that, hard to do in one hand, but I can put it in and out. And realistically, if I want to go back and weld it later, I can. I'll just fill these holes or weld through where the self-tappers were to get this thing all done. So I'm going to get that thrown in and move on to the next thing. Now finally, the Miata has a floor. And I think that's where I'm going to end it. Even though I still have to do some patchwork on the other side, I do think that this video has been going on way too long. It's like 90 degrees out, so I'm sweating my balls off here, but I think this is where I have to end it. I have not done the brakes, and I plan to do those soon, but like I said, this video is all over the place, so I think in another more dedicated video, I can refocus my attention and get back to work. I don't know if any of that makes sense, but this video has spanned literally months as I slowly cut up and start to patch together this car from the carcass that it used to be. So, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. If you did, I'd appreciate it if you'd like, comment, or even subscribe to the channel, and let me know what you want to see on the car, if you have any tips for fabrication, or if there's just a thought you have on the process or the build. So, see you next time. This is me signing off.